Alright class, today we will start with our second look at the Roaring Twenties, and of course the first thing we have to talk about is the economy. That is one of the reasons why it's known as the Roaring Twenties. The economy is going to be going great guns. We'll look at how several different inventions and changes in daily life impacted that. But we will also talk about political corruption. You'll notice we haven't talked a lot about political corruption lately, and so this will be one of those areas that we focus on and start to focus more on as we get deeper into our studies this second semester. So the gentleman we're going to be talking about today is Warren G. Harding, and he's actually going to come up quite a bit in our next two units, particularly in a game we play a little bit later on, or at least his cabinet will. Warren G. Harding takes over for Woodrow Wilson. His time in office starts off very productively. You see there the 1921 Washington Naval Conference, where we're actually agreeing to build no more warships, and some of the same countries that had participated in World War I with us, England, Japan, France, and Italy, all agree. This marks the first time in history that powerful nations have agreed to, it says disarm there, that's a bit grandiose, but I would say it's more reduction in arms. And that's the big idea, is to, hey, we don't need all these weapons. Problems arise, however, because we had loaned out a lot of money during the war. If you remember the movie we watched, they talked about us leveling a $500 billion, with a T, trillion-dollar fine on Germany. Something they wouldn't be able to pay back till 2010. So it took them 92 years to pay that back. We had also loaned money to allies like Britain and France. And so both those nations are struggling to pay us back, as is Germany. We've already seen Germany's problem. Germany can't pay us back because they're still paying France and England back, and they can't buy any goods from England and France because they don't have any money. So it becomes a real problem, and it adds to the problem with the tariffs. And just a reminder, guys, when tariffs happen, it's not the governments that pay them, it is us, the consumers. Those tariffs get passed on in the form of higher prices to us. And so that is why people couldn't afford to buy things ever, which brought global trade to a standstill. So if people aren't buying things, that can create real global problems. That's how you slide into recessions and depressions. So we have to come up with a plan to pay these things back. And if you look here on the screen, we put a guy by the name of Charles Dawes in charge to help France and England and Germany, for that matter, avoid defaulting on their loan payments. It becomes known as the Dawes Plan. And basically what happens here is, you see in this little chart on the right, we loan out this $2.6 billion. It goes to Germany. Germany uses that money to pay back the Allies, $2.0 billion. And they cobbled together $2.6 billion. So we made $1 million there, but we literally loaned ourselves the money to pay ourselves back. We arranged to be repaid with our own money, but it's like a loan. It's sad, it cycles through the economy and comes back to you. What really proved to be Harding's downfall, though, was his cabinet. Harding made the mistake of putting a lot of his good buddies, his cronies as we would call them today, in the cabinet. It came to be known as the Ohio Gang, and they would very quickly prove to be problematic. How problematic? Well, as you see there down at the bottom, you've got Thomas Miller, the head of the Office of Alien Property, getting caught taking bribes. Perhaps more concerning was Charles R. Forbes, the head of the Veterans Bureau, what we would call today the Veterans Administration, in charge of helping all these newly returned World War I vets coming back to no jobs and wounds, horrific wounds like we saw with chemical weapons and whatnot, turning around and selling government and hospital supplies to private companies and profiting off that. He's literally pocketing the money. Instead of helping out our vets, he's scamming them. And so this is just one of the many problems that will cause Warren G. Harding a lot of heartache. The worst scandal, though, was the Teapot Dome scandal, and this centered around some very oil-rich lands. There you see Teapot Dome, Wyoming. That's actually the name of a town. teapot dome. That's because there was a hill in the ground that held all the oil. Sometimes when when there are large rivers of oil, you'll see little hills in the ground, kind of almost like a bubble. And Elk Hills, California. And these were both used by the U.S. Navy. They were supposed to be set aside so that we could, make diesel fuel and motor oil and all this stuff that our Navy needs to be kept on the move. Well, it turned out that the Secretary of the Interior, a guy by the name of Albert B. Fall, who oversees all the national lands, just like our Secretary of the Interior does today, was very close with various oil executives. And so he transferred those oil rivers from the Navy Department to the Interior Department, which meant he oversaw them now, and then he could control who had access to them. It wouldn't be the Navy anymore. He would be the one that decided who had access. So Mr. Fall turns around and leases that land to one of the biggest oil companies in the country at that point in time, Mammoth Oil Company. And would you know it, in return for that, he miraculously receives something like $400,000 worth of loans, bonds, and cash. That, of course, is in back then money, which in the early 1920s would be the equivalent of $6 million today, a little bit short of $6.1 million to be exact. So he took a $6 million bribe to give Mammoth Oil access to these lands. So because of this dastardly act, Mr. Fall becomes the first American cabinet member to be convicted of a felony. How proud. What a proud moment for the United States. And gets found guilty of bribery. Thankfully for President Harding, he died on August 2nd, 1923, just as his friend's scandals were coming to light, and he never had to deal with the shame, the downfall, whatever you want to call it, of losing his prestige, or even himself being put on trial, anything like that. So he is replaced by Calvin Coolidge, and Coolidge will be one of the guys that oversees the Roaring Twenties, but also brings us closer to the Great Depression. And how do we get brought closer to that depression? Well, it's scarily similar to what we see today. It's a pro-business attitude, lower taxes on businesses, which keeps business profits up. The hope there, then, is that these businesses will take those profits and reinvest them in their business, hire more workers, open more factories, things like that. This is known as trickle-down economics today. The problem is, with trickle-down economics, they never do that. What they do is they sit on those funds, and we've seen this play out time and again, and they use it to pad their bottom line so they look better to stockholders, or they can share that money with stockholders, or they buy back their stock. And so it doesn't work out in the way it typically should, where these factories and corporations take care of their employees. Of course, one of the big industries taking over in the 1920s, causing the economy to roar along, is the car, the automobile, really becoming mass-produced for the first time in the late 19-teens, and especially in the 1920s as more and more people were able to afford them and were able to buy them. One, we got better roads. Two, now rural families were able to afford these, and now it's not just a matter of going into town once a week or once a month in some extreme places where you're really far out in the country. Now it's, hey, we've got to run into town. Let's run into town, on Tuesday, and maybe they go in 2-3 times a week, and they get the things they need in short order. We also see roads like Route 66, which runs right here through Illinois, just to our east, over through Bloomington, Normal, Lincoln, on down to St. Louis, between Chicago and St. Louis. That becomes linking Chicago and California. So there you see the statistic. By the late 1920s, around 80% of all registered motor vehicles in the world, that's in the world, guys, were here in the U.S. About 1 for every 5 people in the United States. So roughly 20% of the American population had a car. Ignore that bell in the background. That is not for you. I'm assuming you have ignored me and perhaps all gotten up to leave class thinking that was the classroom bell. Alas, it was not. So come on back to your notes here, kids, and let's keep going here. Also becoming fairly important was the airplane industry. We see transatlantic passenger flights for the first time. It basically became like island hopping. You see here they had floats on them. If you look on that picture on the right, notice the 4 engines above and then the skis below there. It also serves as a way for the postal service to much more quickly distribute mail. In fact, that's how a guy by the name of Charles Lindbergh comes to be associated with Peoria. Lindbergh will fly the mail route between Chicago and St. Louis before being the first man to cross the Atlantic solo in an airplane. Among the other important inventions of the 1920s, you see there, the washing machine replaces the wringer and the washboard. The vacuum cleaner replaces a simple brush and broom. Sewing machines become more advanced, but you'll notice all these things cost substantially more money. In just a span of 30 years, we've seen the cost of a washing machine setup increase exponentially. Same thing with a vacuum cleaner. You know, the cost to clean your house has gone up tenfold. The cost of a sewing machine has more than doubled. So all these things cost more money, which means you've got to have more money to buy these things. You also had to have electricity, which becomes much more prevalent at that point in time, particularly with the development of alternating current. Originally, there was direct current as developed by Thomas Edison, which meant you had to have a power plant in just about every neighborhood. Today, you know, power plants are pretty spread out. It could be, you know, 50, 75 miles from one power plant to the next. Here, however, until alternating current became a thing, as developed by Nikola Tesla, we had to have them in the neighborhoods. Well, with alternating current, now we're able to distribute electric power much more efficiently over much longer distances, and it could even stretch out to the suburbs. So electricity in homes became much more common as well. And of course, this distribution of electricity over longer distances leads to more inventions. You see there the electric refrigerator, the electric stove, toasters, electric irons. All these things came to fruition. If you look here on the in the bottom left, that picture, that's a toaster, and you'll notice it has a cloth cord. We actually found one of these in my in the basement of my house. When my wife and I moved into her grandparents' old house, and they'd actually kept one of these. Those are burn marks on the side of the toaster there, most likely from the cord. Since that's a cloth cord and you've got electricity running through there, it was probably pretty hot to the touch, and so that's what that is. But you would literally put the bread in there, fold up the side, and turn the key to lock it in there. Of course, with all these new products, you need advertising. You got to sell them. You got to get into people's minds. Ignore that bell as well, children. We're still not going anywhere. It's just, as I'm recording this now, it's 7th hour on Monday afternoon, President's Day. That's right, I came into work on my day off because I'm concerned about your children's education. At any rate, we've got to sell these things. And so one of the things that takes place in advertising, they're starting to study what drives people to buy certain things. Is it a product's appeal to youthfulness? Is it beauty? Is it wealth? Is it health? So you see doctors recommending cigarettes. 20,679 physicians say Luckies are more healthy. You see, this is my favorite one. Men wouldn't look at me when I was skinny. This goes back to the different body image, a much more positive body image back in the day for you ladies. Coca-Cola, Gillette razors, so easy a baby can shave with them. So you see all the different types of advertising they used here. So with all this new products and all this going on, cars and factories, all these different things just going great guns. The stock market is way up. A lot of people thought this would last forever, and we don't learn this lesson easily in America because we always think it's going to last forever. We very quickly forget the tough times, and when things are going good, we don't remember much of the bad. But there are some signs coming that things are going to go bad outside of these numbers that you see here. And we'll talk about those on the next slide. Among the signs the problems were headed our way, one, the iron and railroad industries were not doing as well as they had previously. Railroad, obviously they probably took a little hit with the advent of airplanes, but still railroad was the primary mode of passenger transportation. Also shipping goods long distances, no semi-trucks or anything like that yet. So that was a little bit of a warning sign. And then farms. Farms, one, not only kept producing at World War I levels, which we'll talk more about when we get to the Great Depression, but all this new machinery was coming out, which was allowing them to work way more land and grow way more food than was needed. So they kept producing at World War I levels, like they were still trained to make enough food to feed all of Europe, and then grew even more. And of course, we know when you do that, you get a surplus. When you have a surplus, that leads to a fall in prices. And of course, when that drives down prices, it's good for the consumer because it's cheaper for us. Prices fall, but it's not good for the farmer, and there's a lot more farmers. The other thing that we typically don't pay attention to here in the United States is how we're paying for all this stuff. And back then, it was known as the installment plan. This was the early version of credit cards. So, if you can't afford that brand new washing machine straight out, oh, hey, put it on the installment plan. Pay that $150 off over time with interest. Well, that $150 becomes $200 if you don't pay it off in the year. Same thing, with the vacuum cleaner or the toaster or whatever it was. This is the same thing that got us into trouble back in 2007 and 2008. You had people getting loans for homes that they had no business affording, $250,000 homes, when they're making $40,000 a year. So these things, again, we have not learned our lessons as Americans. We keep making the same mistakes over and over. And that is what has put us in this boom and bust cycle economically to this day. So, on the surface, again, it appeared that things were great. People are buying new cars, new refrigerators, new washing machines, vacuum cleaners, etc. That's making the economy go great guns too. When people are buying things like that at a high rate, things are good. But, as several economists pointed out, hey, they're buying these things on the installment plan. And that's not good. That means they don't have this money. So it's a superficial or fake economic prosperity. And if people suddenly don't have the money to pay these bills, the companies are going to be left holding the bag. And that's not a good thing. And so even though this warning was kind of out there, and today we know it, but even today we don't remember it, Americans, just said, to heck with it, we'll worry about that when we get to it. We'll burn that bridge when we get there. And so they focused on the present and kind of ignored some of the warning signs that might have warned them about the Great Depression that was coming just a little bit less than 10 years down the road.